There are some games that stand out among the rest in this industry for different reasons. Whether it be because of their genre-defining and easy-to-learn gameplay like in the case of Super Mario Bros., their unique approach to storytelling like in the case of Half-Life, or something else entirely. Quake, developed by id Software and released in 1996, is one of these games. Quake is so important for so many reasons, and its innovations cannot be understated given how many of them can still be felt in modern games released today. Quake not only moved the first-person shooter genre forward, but also the entire video games industry at the time it was released, and it is for that reason that I want to look back on it today. So I'm going to assume that you already know what Quake is by now, but in case you've been living under a rock for the last 27 years, I'll give a very brief description of it. Quake is a first-person shooter set in a dark fantasy world where your goal is to make it through 4 acts of missions in order to reach the final boss, and filling anything that tries to stop you with a healthy amount of lead along the way. Alright, with that done, let's quickly talk about Quake's story. I'm going to keep this section brief because the story of Quake is not the most interesting thing in the world. The game is set years in the future where humanity is experimenting with teleportation technology, but things go sideways as you would expect. A rift is opened in another dimension and hordes of creatures pour into our world. In response to this, our military creates an advanced soldier capable of pushing back the forces of evil and is tasked with one objective: find the source of the enemies and take it out. This is where you come in. You play as Ranger, a super soldier equipped with advanced weapons and a running speed that would make Sonic jealous. That's pretty much all there is to it. Quake doesn't have any cutscenes, and the few times you do get a story update is through a wall of text after each act you complete. It's a 90s first-person shooter, you shouldn't expect a Shakespeare novel here. And with that out of the way, let's talk about the gameplay of Quake. Quake's gameplay is nothing short of iconic. Its fast-paced run-and-gun action is what everyone remembers it for, and it holds up incredibly well all these years later. A huge part of that is the movement. You move around so fast in this game that you can just fly through levels at breakneck speeds, and it feels amazing. Quake's movement is so well refined that the speedrun for this game is still being moved forward today as people continue to find new ways to speed through these levels. It allows for some cool tricks like bunny hopping, which basically allows you to move around even faster by using precise angled jumps to propel yourself forward. There's also the iconic rocket jump, which lets you sacrifice a bit of your health in order to completely skip entire level sections. You just don't see stuff like this in modern shooters because they're considered exploits, but like, who cares, you know? They're cool mechanics regardless of whether or not they were intentionally implemented. The other thing that makes Quake's gameplay hold up so well is its combat, because of its genius and simplicity. There are 8 different weapons in total, and all of them serve a purpose without feeling redundant or outclassed by something else. Every weapon is incredibly satisfying to use because of their unique feedback and handling. They are also balanced extremely well given that each one is intended for a specific purpose, and as such, you can't just rely on a single weapon to carry you through the entire game. The enemies are the other core pillar that holds up Quake's gameplay. Now, Quake doesn't have a huge enemy roster, and some of them are definitely duds. Looking at you, Spawns. But the enemies it does have are very well designed and test your skill in a way that most other shooters from this era don't. They all have very clear attack animations, so you know when to attack and when to dodge. The Fiends are especially good enemies because of how lethal they are up close, but are basically harmless as long as you keep them far enough away. I will say the Shambler's lightning attack can feel pretty cheap at times given it's literally unavoidable unless you're behind cover, but there is always cover around whenever you have to fight one, so it's not really a big deal. That leads me to bosses, and these are my only real complaint with this game. Actually, Quake doesn't even have any traditional bosses, but instead just has 2 gimmick fights that test you in different ways. The first one is this lava boss, where literally all you have to do is run around in a circle and activate 3 buttons in order to electrocute it. You do this 3 times and the boss dies. It's super basic and pretty much impossible to fail unless you mess up your movement and fall into the lava. The second and final boss is Quake itself. It has a different name, but I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. Here you have to fight your way up a staircase against hordes of enemies until you make your way to a teleporter. There's this floating thing in the arena that occasionally goes near the boss, and you need to enter the teleporter when this happens in order to telefrag it, concluding the game. This is cool the first time you do it, but I would have much preferred a more traditional boss fight to conclude such a great game is all. I mean, even Doom 1 had better bosses than this, but it's a really small nitpick in the grand scheme of things, just something I wanted to point out. Now, Quake is obviously very simple and basic when you compare it to most modern shooters, but I think that's part of why it stood the test of time for as long as it has. Quake doesn't need stuff like cutscenes, reloading, alt fires, an inventory system, or whatever else to be fun, because its core mechanics are just that good. Quake's level design follows this same philosophy too, given how short they all are. They only take about 5 to 10 minutes each, so Quake is perfect for whenever you want to just knock out a few levels and then do something else without it feeling like a big commitment. So many modern games can feel so big and complicated these days that you get overwhelmed just thinking about them. I know it might seem like I'm praising such a minor thing here, but the simplicity in this game is why I love it so much, and why I constantly come back to it. I want to talk about Quake's atmosphere now. Quake is home to one of the most memorable atmospheres in any video game. The level of immersion achieved in this game through its use of lighting and sound was simply unlike anything seen before at the time. Starting with how it looks first. Quake might not look like a whole lot these days with its flat, jagged, and brown textures, but Quake still offers a sense of immersion that even a lot of modern games lack. The second you load into a level, you are instantly teleported to a horrific world filled with monsters where the only one who can help you is you. The lighting plays such a crucial role in this experience because it's what pulls you forward in these levels. It represents an escape from the seemingly never-ending darkness that you will be all too familiar with by the time it ends. And who could forget that iconic rolling purple sky that you just can't help but stare at for a while? Now, visuals are obviously a huge part in creating a great atmosphere, but sound design is equally important, so let's talk about that. The sound design in Quake is equally, if not even more impressive than the visuals that accompany it. Quake is absolutely filled with monster growls, dripping water, distant effects, and everything in between to help create a truly immersive experience. Now, as far as music goes, Quake doesn't really have much of a soundtrack outside of the main title theme. Instead, Quake relies on moody and unsettling lines of sound to set the tone of whatever area you are currently in. Take a listen to this one, for example. Some people have criticized Quake over the years for not having a more traditional heavy metal or rock style soundtrack, but this game simply wouldn't have the incredible atmosphere that it does if you were running around listening to an electric guitar riff the whole time. Aside from that though, the rest of Quake's sound design is also top notch for its time. Weapons all have a satisfying punch to them, and enemies all have a solid range of effects to go with their moves. It's impossible to talk about Quake without bringing up its impact on the games industry and the technology industry as a whole. Powered by the id Tech 2 engine created by John Carmack, or simply the Quake engine as it's most well known as, Quake was the first ever game to render truly 3D spaces. Everything before Quake was either full 2D or used very clever techniques to make something look three-dimensional, like in Doom. It's hard to put into words just how groundbreaking this game was at the time of its full release, and it's crazy to think about how different our industry would be today had Quake never existed. That leads me to my next point: mods. It's also very hard to discuss Quake's legacy without bringing up its incredible mod scene. Mods skyrocketed in popularity pretty much the second people figured out how to create them, and they are one of the primary reasons that Quake has lasted for as long as it has. There are literally thousands of different mods out there, ranging from simple game modes to entire campaigns with massive levels. Modding was so popular for Quake that entire new games were created from it. Did you know that Team Fortress 2 from Valve started its life as a mod for Quake? Pretty cool, huh? There are still new mods to this day being created for Quake 2. Just recently someone created a version of Quake with ray tracing in it, and it looks incredible. Quake modding is also where a ton of developers got their start, where they would eventually go on to create full careers out of game development. The sheer volume of high-quality mods that exist for Quake basically ensures that there is always something new to do in it. Quake dominated online multiplayer in the mid-90s after its release, and played a huge role in popularizing what we know today as arena shooters. While Quake was far from the first online multiplayer game, it was still a massive success from pretty much anyone that had access to it back then. Quake's netcode allowed for endless hours of fragging your opponents in arenas where you race your opponents to a specific kill count number, or in co-op where you and up to 3 others could take on the campaign together. Quake also played a massive role in creating what we know today as esports. Tournaments were huge for Quake given its incredibly tight controls and easy to understand gameplay, so it's no surprise why it became so competitive. Here's another fun fact you may not have known. You know how pretty much all PC games use W, A, S, and D to move your character? Well, that actually came from a competitive Quake player. Just another one of those things that completely changed the way that we interact with games from Quake. Let's go over Quake's expansions now. In February of 1997, Quake received its first official expansion pack, titled Scourge of Armagon and developed by Hypnotic Software. Scourge of Armagon aimed to be a faithful expansion of what made the original Quake campaign so great, but to also improve upon areas where it might have felt a little lacking. Story-wise, this picks up directly after where Quake ended. Still controlling Ranger, you realize that there are still more enemies to be defeated and immediately head towards the source of them, kicking off the expansion. The story is just as absent here as it was in the original. You still get your intermission text updates, but that's it. As far as new stuff, Scourge introduces a couple new enemies, all of which are good additions and really help beefing up Quake's low enemy variety. The final boss is also much better here than either of the ones in the original, given that it's a real boss fight that you can shoot at, so that's nice. There's a couple new weapons to use too, which are good additions. The most noticeable difference when going to this expansion from the base campaign though is the music. Scourge does away with the slow and moody sounds of Quake in favor of a more refined metal soundtrack. I think this works for the most part, but it's definitely not as memorable as the more atmospheric approach of Quake. Aside from that though, it's a really solid expansion, and I would recommend it to anyone looking for more Quake. Dissolution of Eternity, developed by Rogue Entertainment, is the final official expansion released for the original Quake. Plot-wise, it takes place directly after the events of Scourge of Armagon. We find out that there are still enemies wreaking havoc to the land, and we set off to stop them. You know the drill at this point. Like its predecessor, this expansion contains a good amount of additional content that separates itself from the others. The main standout of Dissolution is definitely its additional cast of enemies, featuring a whopping 13 new enemy types and 1 new boss. This has the largest range of enemies by far compared to base Quake and its first expansion, and it really helps in narrowing down on that feeling of just fighting the same enemies over and over again. Unfortunately, Dissolution kinda drops the ball when it comes to new weapons though. It does have new weapons, but they're all just modified versions of pre-existing Quake weapons. There's a lava version of both the nailgun and the rocket launcher, and there's a cluster version of the grenade launcher, as well as a plasma version of the thunderbolt. These are just straight up better versions than their standard counterparts, so much so in fact that they basically trivialize any difficulty that this expansion would have had. I mean, the lava rocket launcher is especially broken because it shoots 3 projectiles for the price of 1 and does more damage than the standard rocket launcher, and there's an abundance of ammo for it. Whenever I replay this expansion, I tend to just not use these weapons because of how much they destroy the balance of Quake. The final boss of this expansion is also super easy compared to the final boss from Scourge of Armagon. Now aside from that complaint, Dissolution is still an excellent expansion for Quake with more great levels and set pieces to shoot your way through, and it's a fitting conclusion to the original Quake trilogy. And that's it. Quake would go on to be known as one of the most influential video games ever created due to its incredibly smooth gameplay, its revolutionary technology and mods, and its industry-defining multiplayer. Quake received multiple sequels and spin-offs both by id Software and other developers, but those are for another day.